January 23rd, 1963. A British intelligence officer walks through the darkened streets of Beirut, carrying no luggage, leaving behind his wife, his colleagues, and a career that had placed him within reach of leading the entire British Secret Service. Harold Adrian Russell Philby boards a Soviet freighter bound for Odessa, aware that within days the West will discover that one of their most trusted intelligence officers had been working for Moscow for 3 decades. The defection will expose the greatest penetration in Western intelligence history, trigger investigations that consume years, and reveal betrayals that sent hundreds of agents to their deaths. This is the story of how the KGB turned Britain's elite into Moscow's deadliest weapons. The Cambridge Five represented more than just another espionage network. When Soviet intelligence recruited these men at Cambridge University during the 1930s, they executed a strategy that would reshape Cold War intelligence operations for generations. The ring consisted of Harold Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, 5 young men from privileged backgrounds who would penetrate the highest levels of British government, military intelligence, and foreign service. What they delivered exceeded every expectation Moscow held for long-term penetration operations. Western counterintelligence agencies had no framework for understanding what the Soviets had accomplished. The 1930s marked a period when communism appealed to intellectuals across Europe, particularly in Britain, where economic depression and the rise of fascism drove idealistic young people toward radical solutions. Cambridge University became a recruiting ground where NKVD officers identified students whose backgrounds, abilities, and ideological commitments made them perfect candidates for lifetime service to Soviet intelligence. These recruiters sought not immediate intelligence gains, but assets who would spend years building credentials, rising through British institutions, and eventually accessing secrets that could shape the balance of power between East and West. The recruitment strategy reflected Soviet patience and sophistication. Rather than approaching established officials and attempting to flip them through blackmail or financial inducement, Moscow's intelligence services invested in young men whose careers lay ahead of them. These students would be instructed to abandon overt communist activities, to build respectable covers, to position themselves for entry into government service. Some would wait years before becoming operational, spending the interim establishing themselves as loyal British subjects, while their Soviet handlers monitored their progress from afar. The investment required faith that these ideological converts would maintain their commitment over decades, resisting the temptations and pressures that might cause them to waver or confess. By the mid-1930s, Soviet intelligence had successfully recruited all 5 members of what would become known as the Cambridge Five, though at the time, neither the recruiters nor the recruits understood the full scope of what they had set in motion. Each man entered British service through different paths. Burgess and MacLean joined the Foreign Office. Blunt entered military intelligence. Cairncross worked in government code-breaking operations. And Philby began building credentials through journalism that would eventually lead him into the secret intelligence service. Together, they would provide the Soviet Union with unprecedented access to British secrets across multiple domains, creating redundancies that ensured Moscow received critical intelligence even if one source became compromised. For British intelligence, this penetration posed a threat that remained invisible for nearly 2 decades. MI5 and MI6 operated under assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. The old boy networks that dominated British intelligence services trusted men from the right schools, the right families, the right backgrounds. Security vetting focused primarily on preventing communist sympathizers from entering government service, but the vetting systems looked for current affiliations, not past ideological commitments that had been carefully concealed. Philby and his colleagues benefited from class privilege that placed them above suspicion, their Cambridge educations and family connections serving as credentials that superseded any rigorous investigation of their beliefs or associations. The strategic vulnerability this created was profound. Soviet intelligence gained insight into British operations across multiple areas simultaneously. When MI6 planned operations against Soviet targets, Philby knew the details and passed them to Moscow. When British code breakers made progress against Soviet communications, Cairncross reported it. When British diplomats negotiated with foreign governments, Maclean revealed the negotiating positions and limits. This comprehensive penetration gave the Soviet Union advantages that extended far beyond tactical intelligence, shaping their strategic understanding of British capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. Harold Adrian Russell Philby was not an obvious candidate for betrayal. Born in 1912 to a family of distinction, his father, Harry St. John Philby, was a renowned explorer, Arabist, and advisor to Saudi Arabia's king. Young Kim, as he was called, attended Westminster School and Trinity College, Cambridge, institutions that produced Britain's governing class. His educational pedigree suggested a conventional path into government service, precisely what Soviet intelligence valued. Yet beneath this privileged exterior, Philby developed convictions that would drive him toward treason that lasted 3 decades. Cambridge in the early 1930s offered fertile ground for radical politics. The Great Depression had shattered confidence in capitalism, unemployment ravaged Britain, and fascism was rising across Europe. Many students viewed communism not as a threatening ideology, but as a rational response to capitalism's failures and fascism's threat. Discussion groups, reading circles, and political societies openly debated Marxist theory. Some students joined the Communist Party of Great Britain, attending meetings and participating in demonstrations. Others, like Philby, absorbed communist ideology while maintaining lower profiles. Arnold Deutsch, an NKVD officer operating undercover in Britain, made contact with Philby in 1934. Deutsch was a sophisticated recruiter who understood how to identify and cultivate assets. He recognized in Philby a combination of ideological commitment, intellectual capability, and social position that made him extraordinarily valuable. The recruitment itself was straightforward. Philby had already decided that the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope against fascism and capitalist exploitation. What Deutsch offered was the opportunity to serve that cause through secret action rather than public advocacy. The instructions Philby received from his Soviet handlers were clear and required patience. He was to distance himself from overt communist activities, to cease attending meetings or associating with known leftists, to build a cover as a conventional young man from a good family pursuing respectable employment. This meant abandoning the political activism that had defined his Cambridge years, a sacrifice that demonstrated his commitment to the mission. For the next several years, Philby followed these instructions methodically, understanding that his value to Soviet intelligence depended on his ability to penetrate British institutions, which required appearing entirely conventional. Philby built his cover through journalism, a profession that offered both respectability and access. He travelled to Spain during the Civil War, reporting from the nationalist side despite his secret sympathies for the Republicans. This choice was calculated. By embedding with Franco's forces and filing dispatches that avoided leftist sympathies, he established credentials as a reliable, non-ideological correspondent. British intelligence services later, reviewing his background, would see a journalist who had covered the Spanish Civil War from the anti-communist side, a detail that suggested political reliability rather than raising suspicion. Entry into British intelligence came during World War II, when Britain desperately needed capable people and recruiting standards relaxed. Philby joined Section D of the Secret Intelligence Service, a sabotage and propaganda unit that operated outside traditional military structures. His performance was competent, his background was impeccable, and his manner inspired confidence. Superiors viewed him as a capable officer from a distinguished family, someone who could be trusted with sensitive work. His stammer, a speech impediment that might have hindered others, somehow enhanced his appeal by making him seem earnest and unpretentious. Promotions came steadily. After Section D was absorbed into the Special Operations Executive, Philby transferred to the Secret Intelligence Service proper, moving through positions that gave him increasing access to classified operations and strategic intelligence. By 1944, he had sufficient seniority and trust to be considered for sensitive postings. When the war ended and MI6 reorganized for peacetime operations, Philby secured appointment as the head of Section 9, the counterintelligence section specifically focused on Soviet operations. The irony of a Soviet agent running British counter-Soviet intelligence operations was apparently lost on those who made the appointment. Section 9 gave Philby comprehensive access to British intelligence operations targeting the Soviet Union. He knew which Soviet officials MI6 attempted to recruit, what technical collection methods were being employed, what friendly intelligence services were reporting about Soviet activities, and what analysis British intelligence produced about Soviet capabilities and intentions. This information flowed to Moscow, where it allowed Soviet intelligence to protect its operations, identify which of its officers were under surveillance, and understand exactly how much the British knew about Soviet activities. The damage was systematic and ongoing, affecting every operation that passed through Section 9. The position also gave Philby influence over British strategy towards Soviet intelligence. He could steer investigations away from productive avenues, suggest priorities that served Soviet interests, and shape assessments in ways that benefited Moscow. When genuine leads emerged that might expose Soviet operations, Philby could ensure they received inadequate resources or were pursued in ways unlikely to yield results. When MI6 officers proposed operations that threatened Soviet interests, he could offer analysis that made those operations seem unwise or unlikely to succeed. This influence operated subtly, always maintaining plausibility, never so obvious as to trigger suspicion. By the late 1940s, Philby had also secured a liaison role with American intelligence services, a position that gave him access to CIA and FBI operations. He spent time in Washington, building relationships with American counterparts and gaining insight into U.S. intelligence capabilities and plans. The Americans trusted him completely, viewing him as a professional from a friendly service with whom they could share sensitive information. This trust gave Philby access to American secrets that he passed to Moscow alongside British intelligence, multiplying his value to the Soviet Union while deepening the damage his betrayal would eventually cause. Yet even as Philby's position strengthened, warning signs emerged that suggested something was wrong within British intelligence. In 1945, Konstantin Volkov, an NKVD officer stationed in Istanbul, attempted to defect to the British, offering to reveal information about Soviet agents operating inside British intelligence. Volkov claimed to know the identities of two senior officials working for Moscow. The case was assigned to Philby, who ensured that Volkov's approach was handled slowly enough that Soviet intelligence could identify, recall, and silence the defector before he could reveal what he knew. Volkov disappeared into Soviet custody and was never seen again. The incident should have triggered questions about why the handling of the case had been so inefficient, but no formal investigation followed. The most serious crisis came in 1951 when Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean defected to the Soviet Union. Both men had been under increasing pressure. MacLean for investigations into leaks of classified information, Burgess from erratic behavior that threatened his position. Their sudden disappearance to Moscow shocked British intelligence and triggered intensive investigations into how two Foreign Office officials could have been working for the Soviets. Philby came under suspicion because of his associations with both men, particularly Burgess, with whom he had shared a house while posted in Washington. American intelligence, particularly the FBI, pressed hard for answers, furious that trusted British officials had been Soviet agents. British intelligence subjected Philby to interrogation. Millicent Baggott, MI5's expert on Soviet intelligence, led questioning that focused on his associations, his time at Cambridge, his relationship with Burgess and MacLean. Philby maintained composure throughout, denying any knowledge of their espionage activities and explaining his associations as the normal social connections of men who attended the same university and moved in similar circles. The interrogators found his answers plausible, or at least impossible to disprove. Without hard evidence of espionage, only suspicions based on association, MI6 could not make a case that would stand up to scrutiny. Despite these suspicions, Philby was not arrested or prosecuted. The evidence remained circumstantial, and prosecuting a senior intelligence officer on such thin grounds would have created a scandal that MI6 wanted to avoid. Instead, Philby was asked to resign from the service, a quiet removal that allowed him to maintain his reputation while ending his access to classified information. For several years, he worked as a journalist, still maintaining contact with Soviet handlers, but no longer able to provide intelligence of the quality and sensitivity he had accessed while inside MI6. Rehabilitation came in 1956 when MI6 recruited Philby as a correspondent in Beirut, ostensibly working for The Observer and The Economist, but actually serving as an intelligence officer operating under journalistic cover. The decision to bring him back demonstrated remarkable failure of institutional memory. or willingness to overlook past suspicions. Some officers within MI6 had never believed Philby was guilty and viewed his resignation as an overreaction to American pressure. Others thought that even if he had been compromised in the past, he could still be useful for operations in the Middle East, where his background and expertise remained valuable. By the early 1960s, Philby had been operating as a Soviet agent for nearly 3 decades. The intelligence he provided shaped Soviet understanding of British and American capabilities throughout the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Operations were compromised, agents were captured and executed, strategic advantages were lost. Yet the full scope of the damage remained hidden, known only to Philby and his Soviet handlers. British and American intelligence agencies suspected penetration, but could not identify the source with certainty. The investigations continued, following leads that sometimes pointed toward Philby, but never accumulated evidence sufficient for prosecution. Operating as a double agent within MI6 required tradecraft that balanced caution with productivity. Philby could not simply photograph every document that crossed his desk or meet his Soviet handlers whenever intelligence became available. Each contact carried risks that accumulated over time, creating patterns that counterintelligence analysts might detect if they knew where to look. The challenge was maintaining a flow of high-value intelligence to Moscow while avoiding the behavioral anomalies that could trigger surveillance or suspicion among colleagues who saw him daily. Communication with Soviet handlers evolved as Philby's position changed and security requirements shifted. During his early years in British intelligence, when his access was limited and his profile lower, meetings occurred with reasonable frequency. Handlers would arrange encounters in London locations where 2 men could speak briefly without attracting attention, cafes or parks where Philby could pass documents or receive instructions. These meetings followed standard tradecraft protocols. Philby would conduct surveillance detection routes before arriving, watching for followers or patterns suggesting he was under observation. The meetings themselves were brief, focused on essential information exchange rather than extended conversation. As Philby rose through MI6 ranks and his value increased, the frequency of direct meetings decreased while their importance grew. Soviet intelligence understood that a senior MI6 officer meeting regularly with the same individual created vulnerability. They shifted toward less frequent personal contacts, supplemented by dead drop systems, where Philby could deposit photographed documents at predetermined locations for later retrieval by Soviet officers he never encountered. These dead drops were scattered across London, chosen for accessibility and the natural cover they provided. A document left in a particular location during an evening walk could be retrieved hours later by a Soviet intelligence officer conducting his own routine activities. Document photography became central to Philby's operation. MI6 officers routinely took files home for evening work, a practice that reflected the service's trust in its personnel and the volume of material requiring analysis. Philby exploited this custom systematically, borrowing files that contained the most sensitive intelligence and photographing them using a Minox camera, a small device specifically designed for espionage photography. The camera could document pages quickly with sufficient quality that Soviet analysts could read the resulting images. Philby would photograph documents in his flat, return the originals to the office the next day, and pass the film to his handlers through whatever method current security conditions permitted. The intelligence Philby prioritized reflected both Soviet requirements and his own understanding of what MI6 knew that Moscow needed to counter. Operations targeting Soviet intelligence officers in Britain or abroad received highest priority. When MI6 identified a Soviet official as likely intelligence personnel and began surveillance, Philby reported it immediately so the officer could modify behavior to avoid exposure or could be recalled before arrest became possible. Lists of intelligence requirements, documents outlining what MI6 wanted to learn about Soviet capabilities, went to Moscow, where they revealed exactly what the British did not know, and therefore what secrets remained safe. Analysis of Soviet intentions. Documents where British intelligence assessed what Moscow might do in various scenarios gave Soviet planners insight into how their adversaries understood Soviet strategy. Specific operations suffered systematic betrayal. The Albanian operation, an MI6 and CIA effort to infiltrate anti-communist guerrillas into Albania to destabilize the communist government, became a death trap because Philby knew the infiltration plans and passed them to Moscow. Soviet intelligence shared the information with their Albanian counterparts, who positioned security forces to capture or kill the infiltrators as they arrived. Multiple operations followed this pattern across Eastern Europe, with agents parachuted or infiltrated into Soviet-controlled territory, only to be captured because Philby had revealed their missions, their training, their intended contacts, and their operational plans. The volume of intelligence Philby passed to Moscow over 3 decades defies precise calculation. Estimates suggest thousands of documents covering everything from specific operations to strategic assessments to technical collection capabilities. This information shaped Soviet understanding of British and American intelligence capabilities continuously, giving Moscow advantages in recruitment, counterintelligence, and strategic planning that persisted throughout the early Cold War. The Soviets knew what operations to avoid, what vulnerabilities to protect, what opportunities to exploit, all because Philby provided comprehensive reporting on Western intelligence activities. Survival required managing not just the mechanics of espionage, but the psychological pressures that accompanied living a double life. Philby maintained his cover through careful attention to professional performance and social behavior. He worked hard at MI6, producing analysis that his superiors valued and building relationships with colleagues who viewed him as competent and trustworthy. His drinking, which became heavier over the years, was seen as normal for MI6 officers of that era, rather than a warning sign. His social life centered on people from his professional world, creating the appearance of a man whose loyalties were exactly what they seemed. The Burgess and McLean defections in 1951 brought Philby closest to exposure before his final years. The interrogations that followed tested his composure under pressure from officers who suspected his involvement but lacked proof. Philby's defense relied on plausible explanations for associations that looked suspicious in retrospect, but had seemed normal at the time. He acknowledged knowing Burgess and McLean from Cambridge, admitted to social relationships with them, but denied any knowledge of their espionage. The interrogators could not break this story because it was mostly true. Philby had known them, had socialized with them, but operational security meant he genuinely did not know the specific intelligence they had passed or the details of their communications with Soviet handlers. This compartmentation, the principle that agents should know only what they needed for their own operations, protected Philby when investigations focused on his colleagues. He could honestly claim ignorance of specifics while maintaining his own separate relationship with Soviet intelligence. The system that protected him also created inefficiencies, preventing coordination between the different agents that might have increased their collective value. Moscow accepted these trade-offs, understanding that compartmentation was essential for protecting long-term assets like Philby, whose value depended on remaining undetected. By early 1963, new evidence had emerged that made Philby's position untenable. Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer who defected to the CIA in December 1962, brought information suggesting a high-level Soviet penetration of British intelligence. While Golitsyn could not name Philby specifically, his details pointed towards someone matching Philby's profile and access. The CIA shared this intelligence with MI6, adding pressure to investigations that had never fully closed after the Burgess and MacLean defections. MI6 dispatched Nicholas Elliott, one of Philby's oldest friends within the service, to Beirut with instructions to confront him and extract a confession. Elliott arrived in Beirut in early January 1963. The confrontation occurred in a private setting where Elliott presented evidence and suspicions that had accumulated over the years. Philby, recognizing that denial would no longer work, offered a partial confession. He admitted to having warned MacLean before the 1951 defection, framing it as a moment of weakness rather than systematic betrayal, spanning decades. Elliott believed he had achieved a breakthrough, that Philby would cooperate fully and provide details about his espionage in exchange for lenient treatment. MI6 planned to bring Philby back to London for thorough debriefing, assuming he would remain in Beirut until arrangements could be made. Philby understood the situation more clearly than his interrogator. A partial confession bought time, but guaranteed nothing. Once in London, facing intensive interrogation and prosecution, his options would disappear. The Soviets had maintained contact with him throughout his Beirut posting, and he signaled his handlers that extraction had become necessary. Moscow agreed, arranging for a Soviet freighter, the Diplomat, scheduled to dock in Beirut, to provide his escape route. January 23, 1963. Philby attended a dinner party that evening, maintaining the routines that had protected him for 3 decades. He drank, conversed with other guests, gave no indication that anything unusual was planned. After the party ended, he told his wife Eleanor that he needed to meet someone briefly and would return shortly. She had no reason to doubt him. He walked into Beirut's night, carrying nothing that would suggest departure. No luggage, no documents, no personal effects that might signal flight. The streets were quiet as he made his way toward the harbor. Beirut's waterfront, busy during daylight hours with commercial shipping and fishing vessels, offered shadows and anonymity after dark. Philby had studied the route, understanding where surveillance might be positioned and how to avoid patterns that would attract attention from watchers who might be monitoring his movements. His years of operational training served him now. The techniques he had learned for meeting agents and conducting clandestine activities applied to his own escape. The Dolmatova sat at anchor, a Soviet merchant vessel whose presence in Beirut aroused no particular suspicion given regular commercial traffic between Middle Eastern ports and the Soviet Union. Philby reached the vessel and made contact with crew members who had been briefed to expect him. Within minutes, he was aboard, taken below deck to quarters, where he would remain hidden until the ship departed Beirut. The crew knew what cargo they carried, understood the importance of ensuring no one saw the British defector who had become the Soviet Union's most valuable intelligence asset. The voyage to Odessa took days, time Philby spent processing what he had abandoned and what lay ahead. His wife would discover his disappearance within hours, triggering alarm that would spread through British intelligence services. Colleagues would realize that Elliot's interrogation had not secured cooperation, but had instead prompted flight. The partial confession would be recognized as misdirection, buying time for escape rather than genuine contrition. Everything Philby had built in Beirut, the cover as a journalist, the social connections, the operational access, dissolved the moment the Dolmatova cleared Lebanese waters. Eleanor Philby waited through the night of January 23rd, growing increasingly concerned as hours passed without her husband's return. By morning, she contacted British officials who began searching for him while suspecting what had occurred. Diplomatic inquiries with Lebanese authorities produced nothing useful. Checks with airlines and shipping companies revealed no record of Philby booking passage anywhere. MI6 officers in Beirut understood before confirmation arrived that he had fled, almost certainly to the Soviet Union. News reached London within days, though official confirmation took longer as the Soviets maintained silence about whether Philby had arrived in Moscow. British intelligence faced the reality that their interrogation had failed catastrophically, that rather than securing cooperation from a compromised officer, they had triggered the defection of someone whose knowledge of Western operations was comprehensive. Elliot's friendship with Philby, leveraged to extract confession, had instead given Philby warning that arrest was imminent. The Dolmatova reached Odessa in early February. Philby disembarked onto Soviet soil, ending his 3 decades as a British intelligence officer and beginning his life as a KGB asset living in Moscow. Soviet officials received him with ceremony appropriate to his value, though details of his arrival remained classified. He had delivered himself along with everything he knew about British and American intelligence operations, tradecraft, personnel, and strategic assessments. Confirmation of Philby's defection triggered emergency procedures across Western intelligence services. MI6 headquarters in London received notification from Beirut that Philby had disappeared, followed within days by intelligence suggesting he had reached the Soviet Union. The initial response combined disbelief with growing alarm as officers who had worked with Philby for years struggled to accept that their colleague had been a Soviet agent throughout his career. MI5, responsible for counterintelligence within Britain, immediately launched investigations to determine what damage Philby might have caused and whether other penetrations remained undetected. The CIA learned of the defection through liaison channels that connected American and British intelligence services. James Jesus Angleton, chief of CIA counterintelligence, received the news with fury tempered by vindication. Angleton had long suspected Soviet penetration of Western services and had clashed with colleagues who viewed his suspicions as paranoid. Philby's defection proved that deep penetration was possible. The trusted officers could betray their services for decades without detection. The revelation would drive Angleton toward increasingly destructive mole hunts that paralyzed CIA operations for years. But in early 1963, his immediate concern focused on assessing what Philby had learned about American intelligence and what operations required immediate shutdown. Emergency damage assessment teams formed in both London and Washington. Every operation Philby had touched, every document he had seen, every briefing he had attended required review under the assumption that Moscow knew everything. This meant examining files spanning decades, interviewing hundreds of officers who had worked with Philby, and attempting to reconstruct what intelligence he could have passed to his Soviet handlers. The scale of the review was staggering, complicated by the reality that Philby's positions had given him access to some of the most sensitive operations British and American intelligence conducted during the early Cold War. Operations were shut down immediately where Philby's knowledge posed direct threats to agents or sources still active. Western intelligence officers working in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe were recalled or warned that their cover might be compromised. Sources who had provided intelligence on Soviet activities were contacted and offered extraction if they believed exposure was imminent. Networks that Philby knew about were suspended pending assessment of whether they could continue operating safely. Each shutdown represented not just lost intelligence, but years of work building relationships and access that could not be quickly replaced. The British government faced decisions about public disclosure. Philby's defection could not be hidden indefinitely, but revealing it would trigger questions about how a Soviet agent had risen so high in British intelligence and remained undetected for so long. Parliamentary inquiries would demand answers, the press would investigate, and Britain's relationship with the United States would suffer further damage after the earlier Burgess and McLean scandal. The government delayed public announcement, while investigators worked to understand the full scope of what had occurred. But by July 1963, official confirmation came that Philby had defected and had likely been working for the Soviets since the 1930s. Every operation Philby had touched required review with the assumption of complete compromise. British and American intelligence officers worked through files methodically, identifying missions where Philby's knowledge could have enabled Soviet countermeasures. The process revealed betrayals that spanned continents and decades, operations that had failed for reasons attributed to bad luck or operational security lapses, but which now appeared as deliberate sabotage orchestrated through intelligence Philby provided to Moscow. The examination documented a pattern of systematic destruction that affected every domain where Western intelligence operated against Soviet targets. The Albanian operation represented one of the clearest examples of how Philby's betrayal translated into deaths. In 1949, British and American intelligence launched an effort to destabilize Albania's communist government by infiltrating anti-communist guerrillas who would organize resistance and potentially trigger an uprising. The operation involved recruiting Albanian exiles, training them in sabotage and guerrilla warfare, and parachuting them into remote areas where they could establish bases and recruit local support. Philby, as head of MI6's Section 09 and through his liaison role with the CIA, knew every detail of the planning the training sites, the infiltration routes, the communications procedures, and the identities of agents being sent. Soviet intelligence received this information and passed it to Albanian security services, who positioned forces to intercept the infiltrators. As agents parachuted into Albania, security forces were waiting. Some were killed immediately upon landing. Others were captured, interrogated, and executed after revealing whatever information torture extracted. A few managed to evade capture initially, but were hunted down systematically as Albanian forces knew exactly where the agents intended to establish operations. The operation continued for several years, with multiple waves of infiltrators sent despite mounting evidence that something was catastrophically wrong. Philby's position allowed him to monitor these concerns and provide reassurances that operational security remained sound, ensuring the operation continued feeding men into a trap he had created. Beyond Albania, Western intelligence networks across Eastern Europe suffered systematic compromise. Agents recruited to report on Soviet military capabilities, economic conditions, or political developments were identified and arrested. Some disappeared into Soviet prisons or labor camps. Others were executed after show trials that demonstrated to domestic audiences the reach of state security services. The pattern repeated across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. Networks that had taken years to establish collapsed within months as Soviet and Eastern European security services rolled up agents whose identities, communication methods, and operational procedures Philby had revealed. The Konstantin Volkov case in 1945 illustrated how Philby's betrayals operated at the individual level. Volkov, an NKVD officer stationed in Istanbul, approached British intelligence offering to defect and provide information about Soviet espionage operations. He claimed knowledge of Soviet agents operating inside British intelligence, information that could have exposed Philby and potentially other members of the Cambridge Ring years before the damage they caused reached its full extent. The case was assigned to Philby, who ensured that British response was delayed through bureaucratic obstacles while simultaneously alerting his Soviet handlers to Volkov's betrayal. Soviet intelligence moved quickly, recalling Volkov to Moscow before British officers could properly debrief him. Volkov and his wife were flown out of Turkey heavily sedated, visible through aircraft windows as warnings to anyone else considering defection. They were never seen again, almost certainly executed after interrogation revealed what they had planned to tell the British. Estimates of how many agents died because of Philby's betrayals vary, depending on how investigators calculated direct versus indirect responsibility. Some assessments suggest hundreds of individuals were executed or imprisoned based on intelligence Philby provided. Others argue the number may be higher when accounting for agents whose identities Philby revealed to the Soviets over 3 decades of espionage. Family members of executed agents also suffered, facing persecution in Soviet-controlled territories where association with spies brought punishment. Children lost parents. Wives became widows. Entire family lines were destroyed because someone had chosen to work with Western intelligence, and Philby had reported them to Moscow. The strategic intelligence Philby compromised extended beyond specific operations to broader categories of information that shaped Soviet understanding of Western capabilities and intentions. As head of Section 9, He provided Moscow with comprehensive intelligence about what British services knew regarding Soviet espionage methods, which Soviet officials were under surveillance, what technical collection capabilities the West possessed, and how British analysts assessed Soviet strategic intentions. This information allowed Soviet intelligence to protect operations by modifying procedures that British services had identified, to recall or reassign officers who were being monitored, and to understand exactly what secrets remained secure and what vulnerabilities required additional protection. His role in Anglo-American liaison gave the Soviets insight into intelligence sharing between Britain and the United States, revealing what each service knew about Soviet activities and how they coordinated operations. This understanding helped Soviet intelligence exploit gaps between the services, identify areas where collection was concentrated, and assess overall Western intelligence capabilities against Soviet targets. Philby attended conferences where American and British officers discussed strategy, reviewed joint operations, and shared assessments. Everything discussed in these meetings reached Moscow, giving Soviet planners advantages in strategic decision-making that persisted throughout the early Cold War. Access to signals intelligence represented another category of strategic compromise. Through his positions in British intelligence, Philby learned about Western code-breaking successes against Soviet communications, information that allowed Moscow to modify encryption systems and communications procedures to close vulnerabilities. When Western cryptanalysts made progress against Soviet codes, Philby reported it, enabling the Soviets to change systems before significant intelligence could be collected. This dynamic meant that Western technical collection efforts faced a moving target, with the Soviets modifying systems in response to successes Philby revealed, creating a cycle that limited the effectiveness of what should have been among the West's most valuable intelligence sources. Damage that could not be quantified included operations that were never launched because Philby advised against them, steering British intelligence away from productive avenues while suggesting priorities that served Soviet interests. His influence shaped institutional understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions in ways that benefited Moscow. When British intelligence developed assessments of Soviet strategy, Philby's input affected those analyses, potentially causing Western planners to misunderstand Soviet actions or to overestimate or underestimate Soviet capabilities in areas where accurate understanding was critical. Soviet agents Philby protected by diverting investigations or providing false assurances about their loyalty represented another category of hidden damage. If investigations began pointing toward individuals who were actually working for Moscow, Philby could suggest that evidence was circumstantial or that other explanations were more plausible. His credibility within MI6 meant his assessments carried weight, allowing him to shield other Soviet assets while maintaining his own cover. Some of these protected agents may have continued operating for years after Philby's defection, their identities still unknown to Western counterintelligence. The full scope of what Philby revealed may never be completely documented. Some operations remain classified decades after his defection, their details protected by governments that continue to guard intelligence sources and methods. Philby himself took secrets to his grave when he died in Moscow in 1988, never providing complete accounting of everything he passed to Soviet handlers during 30 years of espionage. The damage assessment teams working through files in 1963 could only catalogue what records revealed and what surviving participants remembered. Gaps in documentation, destroyed files, and operations conducted without creating paper trails meant that portions of Philby's betrayal remained unrecorded and therefore unmeasured in official assessments. For Soviet intelligence, the Philby operation represented the most successful penetration in the history of espionage. No other Western asset provided Moscow with intelligence of comparable scope, duration, or strategic value. From 1934, when he was recruited, until 1963, when he defected, Philby supplied information that shaped Soviet understanding of British and American capabilities, protect Soviet operations from Western countermeasures, and gave Moscow advantages in strategic decision-making that influenced outcomes during the most dangerous confrontations of the Cold War. The intelligence he provided was not limited to tactical details about specific operations, though those alone would have justified the resources Soviet intelligence invested in recruiting and running him. Philby offered something more valuable: comprehensive insight into how Western intelligence services functioned, what they knew, what they were trying to learn, and how they assessed Soviet actions. During World War II, when Britain and the Soviet Union were allies fighting Nazi Germany, Philby's position in British intelligence gave him access to information about Allied planning that Moscow valued, despite the wartime cooperation. Soviet leaders trusted their British and American allies only to the extent necessary for defeating Germany, while simultaneously preparing for the post-war competition they knew would follow. Philby provided intelligence on how British intelligence assessed Soviet capabilities and intentions, what concerns British planners held about Soviet post-war ambitions, and how Anglo-American cooperation functioned in intelligence sharing. This information helped Soviet planners understand Western thinking about the post-war order while the war was still being fought, allowing them to position themselves advantageously for the coming Cold War. Post-war strategic intelligence became even more critical as the wartime alliance dissolved into hostile competition. Philby's rise to head Section 9 coincided with the beginning of the Cold War, giving him access to British intelligence operations against Soviet targets at precisely the moment when those operations expanded dramatically. He knew which Soviet officials MI6 attempted to recruit, what inducements were offered, what vulnerabilities British intelligence believed could be exploited. This allowed Soviet counterintelligence to protect vulnerable personnel, to prepare those targeted for recruitment, and in some cases to run double agent operations that fed false information to British handlers while identifying what MI6 wanted to learn. Technical collection capabilities that Philby revealed gave the Soviets understanding of Western surveillance methods, enabling them to modify procedures to avoid detection. When British intelligence developed new technical collection systems for intercepting Soviet communications or monitoring Soviet facilities, Philby reported these capabilities to Moscow. Soviet security services could then implement countermeasures, changing encryption systems, modifying communications procedures, or relocating sensitive activities to facilities not under Western surveillance. The cycle of Western innovation, followed by Soviet countermeasure, with Philby providing the intelligence that enabled rapid Soviet response, limited the effectiveness of expensive technical programs that should have provided significant intelligence advantages. Strategic deception operations became possible because Moscow understood what Western intelligence knew and what gaps existed in their knowledge. Soviet planners could craft deception campaigns that exploited these gaps, feeding information through channels they knew Western services monitored while protecting information they did not want revealed. Philby's reporting on what British intelligence assessed about Soviet capabilities in various domains allowed Soviet planners to understand which deceptions would be credible and which would be rejected as implausible. This enabled sophisticated disinformation operations that shaped Western understanding of Soviet military capabilities, economic conditions, and political intentions. The protection Philby provided to Soviet intelligence operations in the West represented another category of value that extended beyond specific intelligence he passed. When Western counterintelligence began investigating possible Soviet penetrations, Philby could monitor those investigations from inside British intelligence, warning Moscow when operations were at risk and allowing Soviet intelligence to modify procedures, recall officers, or shut down networks before Western services could expose them. This protective function meant that Soviet intelligence operations in Britain and Allied nations operated with reduced risk, knowing that Philby could provide early warning if Western counterintelligence began making progress. Training and institutional knowledge that Soviet intelligence gained from Philby's career influenced how they conducted operations for decades. Soviet intelligence officers studied Philby's methods, learning from his success at penetrating and rising through British intelligence while avoiding detection. His tradecraft became case studies in Soviet intelligence training programs, demonstrating how long-term assets should be managed, how cover should be maintained, and how intelligence should be passed while minimizing risk. The institutional lessons. Soviet intelligence extracted from the Philby case shaped their approach to recruiting and running agents in Western nations, influencing operations that continued long after his defection. Propaganda value, though secondary to operational intelligence, provided the Soviets with material for demonstrating the superiority of their intelligence services over Western counterparts. Philby's success at operating undetected for 30 years became proof that Soviet intelligence could penetrate the highest levels of Western governments. That capitalism's internal contradictions created vulnerabilities that communism could exploit. Soviet media eventually publicized Philby's defection as evidence of ideological commitment overcoming material privilege, a narrative that served propaganda purposes while obscuring the reality that Philby's betrayal stemmed from complex motivations that evolved over his 3 decades of espionage. The Philby case triggered reforms that transformed Western intelligence services. Security vetting procedures that had relied heavily on social background and institutional trust were overhauled to include more rigorous investigation of political beliefs, financial circumstances, and personal vulnerabilities. The assumption that graduates of elite universities from prominent families could be trusted based on class credentials died with Philby's exposure. New protocols required background investigations that examined candidates' entire histories. looking for ideological commitments, associations with foreign nationals, or personal circumstances that might make them susceptible to recruitment by hostile intelligence services. Polygraph examinations, previously used sparingly, became standard for personnel handling classified information, though their effectiveness remained debated within counterintelligence circles. MI6 and MI5 underwent organizational changes designed to prevent future penetrations from reaching the scale Philby achieved. Compartmentation became stricter, limiting how much information any single officer could access regardless of rank or position. The principle that officers should know only what they needed for their specific responsibilities already present in intelligence work was enforced more rigorously, with systems designed to detect when officers accessed information outside their areas of responsibility. This created inefficiencies as collaboration became more difficult, but the alternative, allowing the kind of comprehensive access Philby had exploited, was no longer acceptable. The CIA implemented similar reforms while simultaneously descending into mole hunt paranoia that would damage American intelligence capabilities for years. James Jesus Angleton, convinced that Philby's success proved Soviet penetration was widespread, launched investigations that destroyed careers and paralyzed operations. Officers came under suspicion based on circumstantial evidence or patterns that Angleton interpreted as indicating Soviet recruitment. Some investigations focused on individuals whose only crime was having known Philby or other suspected Soviet agents. Others targeted officers whose operational judgments Angleton questioned, suspecting that failed operations or unexpected Soviet responses indicated betrayal rather than operational difficulties or Soviet competence. Arthur Martin and Peter Wright, counterintelligence officers within MI5, pursued investigations into suspected additional Soviet penetrations of British services with similar intensity. Their work uncovered legitimate security concerns, but also generated false accusations that ruined reputations of innocent officers. The mole hunts created atmospheres where colleagues suspected each other, where casual associations became evidence of conspiracy, where operational setbacks triggered investigations rather than being accepted as normal risks of intelligence work. Officers became reluctant to take initiative or make controversial recommendations, fearing that failed operations would be interpreted as sabotage rather than honest miscalculation. Roger Hollis, Director General of MI5 from 1956 to 1965, became a target of mole hunt suspicions despite no concrete evidence of treachery. Wright and others believed that Philby could not have operated successfully for so long without additional help inside British counterintelligence, and Hollis's position made him a plausible suspect. Investigations examined his career, associations, and decisions, looking for patterns suggesting Soviet control. Nothing definitive emerged, but suspicions persisted, fed by the logic that if Philby had penetrated MI6 so successfully, surely MI5 must also have been compromised. This reasoning, while understandable given Philby's betrayal, led investigators toward conclusions not supported by evidence. The human cost of these investigations extended beyond those directly accused. Families suffered as officers under suspicion faced professional isolation and personal stress. Careers were destroyed even when formal charges were never filed, as suspicion alone was sufficient to end promotions and limit responsibilities. Some officers resigned rather than endure investigations that might drag on for years. Others remained in service under clouds of doubt that never fully lifted, regardless of investigation outcomes. The culture within intelligence services shifted from trust towards suspicion, making recruitment of talented personnel more difficult, as potential candidates questioned whether they wanted careers in environments where colleagues might be investigating them. Philby arrived in Moscow to reception that reflected his value while managing the propaganda implications carefully. The Soviet Union initially did not publicly confirm his presence, maintaining ambiguity that complicated British diplomatic protests. When Moscow eventually acknowledged that Philby had defected, he was presented as an ideological hero who had chosen communism over capitalist privilege. The KGB awarded him rank of colonel, later general, providing pension and apartment in central Moscow. His life in the Soviet Union, while materially comfortable compared to ordinary Soviet citizens, lacked the status and purpose his British career had provided. He married Rufina Pukova, a Russian woman who became his companion during his Moscow years. His previous wife, Eleanor, whom he had abandoned in Beirut, eventually joined him in Moscow, but the marriage collapsed under the strain of his betrayal and the reality of Soviet life. Philby worked as advisor to the KGB, training officers and providing analysis based on his knowledge of Western intelligence services. His expertise remained valuable even after his defection, as he could explain how MI6 and CIA operated, what vulnerabilities existed, and how Soviet intelligence could exploit Western procedures. Occasional press conferences and interviews allowed Philby to present himself as a committed communist who had served the cause he believed just. He published a memoir titled My Silent War that defended his espionage as ideological commitment rather than betrayal, claiming that his loyalty to communism superseded any obligation to Britain. The book provided his version of events while omitting details that might compromise Soviet operations or expose other agents. Western intelligence services analyzed the memoir carefully, looking for clues about operations they might not have known were compromised. But Philby revealed little beyond what investigations had already uncovered. Relationships with other British defectors in Moscow were complex. Guy Burgess, who had defected in 1951, lived in Moscow until his death in 1963, just months after Philby's arrival. Donald MacLean, the other 1951 defector, maintained distance from Philby, their relationship strained by years of separation and different experiences adapting to Soviet life. George Blake, another British intelligence officer who spied for the Soviets and escaped to Moscow in 1966, became part of the small community of British defectors navigating life in the Soviet Union. Philby's death in Moscow on May 11, 1988, came after years of declining health exacerbated by heavy drinking that had characterized much of his adult life. The Soviet Union gave him funeral with military honors, burying him at Kuntsevo Cemetery, where intelligence officers and Soviet heroes were interred. The funeral reflected official recognition of his service to Soviet intelligence, though by 1988, the Soviet Union itself was approaching the collapse that would come 3 years later. Philby did not live to see the end of the system he had served for more than half a century. In Britain and America, debates over Philby's impact continued long after his death. Some analysts argued that his betrayals, while extensive, had not fundamentally altered Cold War outcomes, that the operations he compromised would have failed anyway due to Soviet counterintelligence capabilities or operational security failures. Others maintained that Philby had given the Soviet Union strategic advantages that influenced major decisions, that agents died because of his betrayal who might otherwise have survived, that Western intelligence capabilities were degraded in ways that affected Cold War competition. The full accounting remained impossible as files stayed classified and participants died taking their knowledge to graves. Subsequent revelations from Soviet archives opened after the Cold War ended provided some additional details about Philby's work, confirming the general scope of his espionage while leaving many specifics unclear. Soviet intelligence officers who had handled Philby or worked with intelligence he provided offered accounts that sometimes contradicted Western assessments of his importance. Some portrayed him as the most valuable agent Soviet intelligence ever ran. Others suggested that while Philby provided useful intelligence, the legend surrounding him exceeded reality. The Soviet intelligence successes in the West resulted from multiple sources rather than any single penetration. Files that remain classified ensure that complete understanding of what Philby revealed and what damage resulted may never be possible. Governments continue protecting intelligence sources and methods decades after events occurred, maintaining secrecy about operations, techniques, and personnel that Philby compromised. Families of agents who died never learned the full circumstances of their relatives' fates. Operations that failed were never fully explained to officers who participated in them. The shadow Philby cast over Western intelligence extended beyond measurable damage to create uncertainty about what was known and what remained hidden. The Philby case demonstrated that the most sophisticated security systems remained vulnerable to the oldest weapon in intelligence work: the trusted insider willing to betray everything. Technology could intercept communications, satellites could photograph installations, but none of these capabilities protected against someone inside the organization who chose to pass secrets to adversaries. Trust, the foundation of any intelligence service's ability to function, became both essential for operations and the vulnerability that enemies could exploit when they successfully recruited someone who possessed that trust. Philby's 30 years of undetected espionage proved that ideology, carefully concealed and patiently maintained, could motivate betrayal that endured across decades despite pressures and risks that might have broken someone operating from purely mercenary motives. What remains certain is that his betrayal altered intelligence practices permanently, creating institutional skepticism that persists in Western services decades after his death. A legacy measured not just in operations compromised or lives lost, but in the fundamental change in how intelligence organizations view the human beings they trust with their most sensitive secrets. Thank you for watching this story. Until the end, the Philby case remains one of the most damaging intelligence penetrations in history, proving that sometimes the greatest threats come not from outside, but from within. If you found this story captivating, please share it with others who appreciate untold history. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the hidden operations that shaped our world. Your support helps us bring these remarkable stories to light. Until next time, stay curious